Chapter 4. Rudolf Carnap, blaming the West for the Iron Curtain. Since the First World War, Carnap stood politically very far to the left. His reaction to the Marxist critique of philosophical empiricism is worth noting. Whereas he criticized traditional metaphysical philosophers very sharply, he did not attack or criticize the Marxists. Wolfgang Stegmuller. In discussing the political opinions and actions of logical positivists, our attention inevitably turns to the indisputably most important member of that movement, Rudolf Carnap. What were his views? Where did he stand compared to the notoriously radical Neurath? The surprising answer is that, in terms of politics, there is some evidence that in the interwar period there was no difference at all between these two philosophers. According to a credible source, Carnap once said to the philosopher Robert S. Cohen, "If you want to find out what my political views were in the 20s and 30s, read Otto Neurath's books and articles of that time. His views were also mine." The huge difference between the two positivists was, of course, that Carnap devoted most of his energies to scholarship and did not have the time or interest for the kind of political activism Neurath was involved in. Carnap's political engagement was restricted to being a sponsor for various leftist causes and signing political petitions. But this still tells us a lot about the man. Carnap wrote in his diary that he once expressed an inclination to communism. This was in 1934, at the time when Stalin had already consolidated his power and immediately after the horror of the Holodomor had been reported in all media. He never joined the Communist Party, although he supported many of its actions. Political scientist Alan Gilbert gives an interesting explanation why Carnap never became a communist. Carnap rightly felt that the only decent response to McCarthyism was to join the Communist Party. He tried to look it up in the Los Angeles phone book, but the party, under attack, had gone underground and was no longer listed. So he couldn't join. This hilarious story is probably true because Gilbert got it from Hilary Putnam, who had worked closely with Carnap in the early 50s. Carnap publicly supported many progressive causes and signed many petitions that appeared in the Daily Worker, the newspaper of the Communist Party of the United States. So what, some will say? The Communist Party was a completely legal organization. As long as the views he defended were reasonable, it should not matter much where they were published. Doesn't objecting to someone's association with communists smack of McCarthy-era witch hunting? Not really. Consider the following analogous situation. If a person's name regularly appeared in a bulletin of the Ku Klux Klan, usually we would not regard this as acceptable for an educator at a major American university, even if there were nothing particularly problematic about specific views he advocated there. Say, support for family values. The association matters. Many people during the Cold War were suspicious of Communist Party members, as well as of fellow travelers, because they believed that, rather than being an autonomous political organization, the party was controlled from abroad by the totalitarian and unfriendly government of the Soviet Union. These suspicions were later conclusively confirmed by a number of historical documents. One detail that speaks volumes is that the whole archive of the Communist Party of the United States up to 1943, when the Communist International was dissolved, is still not in America, but in Moscow. Also, the search for communist spies in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s, which was at the time often dismissed as a witch hunt, was later shown to have been based on justified fears. In light of the declassified Venona documents and data from the Russian archives that became briefly accessible to Western scholars after the fall of communism, it is no longer possible to deny that witches actually did exist and that, moreover, some of them were placed in very high positions of the American government. So Carnap's frequent association with the communist newspaper gives us at least some reason to question his judgment. But what about his stand on particular issues? This is worse. Henry Wallace, clueless in Colima and elsewhere. In 1948, Carnap supported the presidential bid of Henry Wallace. Wallace had served as Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 till 1945, but he was dropped from the ticket for Roosevelt's 1944 presidential run. He served later as Secretary of Commerce in the Truman administration, but was soon fired for making public statements that were regarded as too pro-Soviet. In the 1948 election, Wallace ran as a candidate of the newly founded Progressive Party, garnering around 2% of the vote. One reason for the lackluster response to Wallace's candidacy was that many people were troubled by what they saw as undue influence by the Communist Party on his campaign. Indeed, it was later confirmed that a number of undercover communists had infiltrated the campaign headquarters and in some cases went so far as to insert into Wallace's speeches specific comments that were directly lifted from articles published in the Daily Worker. Later, in 1953, Wallace himself admitted that allowing the penetration of his party by communists was his major mistake, and that this was why many potential voters were justifiably turned off. There were millions of liberals who wanted to be associated with what we stood for in the Progressive Party, but who did not want to be in the same party with certain very loud-mouthed people who preached a doctrine utterly in line with the Communist Party at all times. While I did not realize it fully during the campaign, I began to realize it more and more after the campaign ended that it is impossible to have anything in the nature of a common front with the Communist Party. My only regret is that I did not hit harder in this direction. Because I did not, the liberals felt justified in leaving us. In retrospect, I cannot criticize them for so doing. In a harsh retrospective judgment, Wallace later went so far as to confirm the suspicion voiced by many during the campaign that his Progressive Party had in fact turned out to be a division of Stalin's Foreign Legion. But these worries apparently never tormented Carnap, nor, for that matter, Einstein or Gödel, who both also supported Wallace. Gödel wrote in a letter to Einstein on June 9, 1948, "You have perhaps heard about the great success that Henry Wallace, a close colleague of Roosevelt's, had on his campaign tour. This seems to prove yet at least that the country is not as reactionary as the present regime." Notice again the term reactionary. It is only from a far-left perspective that the politics of the Democrat Harry Truman could be seen as reactionary. Anyway, the cornerstone of Wallace's campaign was his radical criticism of American foreign policy, which appealed to Carnap. One of the most shocking events in 1948 was the communist coup in Czechoslovakia. It was seen by a huge majority in the United States and in the West generally as the frightening advance of Soviet totalitarianism into Eastern Europe and the enslavement of a country that had a long tradition of democracy and civil liberties. Surprisingly, Wallace begged to differ. He actually saw this development as a justified reaction of the Soviet Union. According to the New York Times, March 17, 1948, Wallace claimed in a press conference that the communists had seized power in Czechoslovakia to protect themselves against a rightist coup started in Prague by the United States ambassador. When it turned out that the ambassador was on leave and was not even in Prague at the time, Wallace did not back down, but declared that the ambassador's expression of hope that Czechoslovakia would be able to take part in the Marshall Plan was a clearly provocative statement and a contributing factor to the Czech crisis. 2. The ambassador's mere offer of economic assistance was a provocative statement that somehow justifies the communist takeover and abolition of democracy. This was just too much for many people who may have agreed with Wallace on some other issues. For example, Walter Mondale, a well-known Democratic Party politician and the vice president of the U.S. in the Carter administration, says that after hearing Wallace's bizarre justification of the communist coup, he thought to himself, "I'm not going to be a part of this." Many Progressive Party sympathizers were perplexed as well and withdrew their support for Wallace. In fact, even Wallace himself soon acknowledged that his reaction to this episode had been mistaken. I was deeply moved by reports of friends who had visited Czechoslovakia shortly after the communists took control. In the summer of 1949, a member of the Progressive Party visited Czechoslovakia and reported the dispossession of relatives whose only crime was to own a small business. No one, I was told, could amount to anything who was not an outspoken critic of the U.S. and capitalism. Only Moscow-trained communists were allowed in positions of authority. As I look back over the past 10 years, I now feel that my greatest mistake was in not denouncing the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia of 1948. So Wallace realized his momentous mistake and regretted it bitterly, but not Carnap. Strange as it may sound, Carnap also blamed the West for the situation in Eastern Europe, writing to the philosopher and pronounced anti-communist Sidney Hook on March 24, 1949. Since our government is persistently refusing to extend goodwill and cooperation to the other side, I welcome the getting together of scientists and artists in an attempt to lift the Iron Curtain, which is chiefly caused by our military threats, and to show each other respect and goodwill. The Iron Curtain, chiefly caused by American military threats? That seems off the wall, to put it mildly. The suggestion is that the division of Europe, with Russian tanks protecting the puppet regimes of Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, was mainly the result of American saber-rattling. Did Carnap really believe this? It seems he did. For his letter defending that strange hypothesis was a part of a very unfriendly exchange with Hook, in which he was presumably trying to express only those views he firmly believed to be both true and rationally defensible. Carnap had lived and taught in Prague from 1931 till 1935, but a decade or so later, he showed a poor understanding of the plight of the country that had once given him hospitality. At a time when the only glimmer of hope for people in Eastern Europe was the possibility that Western pressure would somehow ease the stranglehold of Soviet tyranny, Carnap argued that the West should stop provoking the USSR. Not only that, he attributed responsibility for the predicament of countries with people's democracies more to Truman than to Stalin. People living behind the Iron Curtain would have regarded Carnap's opinion as nothing but a bad joke against the imaginary gulag, but not the real one. Another issue that created a lot of negative publicity for Wallace was his opposition to the Marshall Plan. Among other things, he said that the Marshall Plan, which he was wont to spell Marshall Plan, was a blueprint for war introduced by militarists and Wall Street monopolists, intended to suppress the democratic movements in Europe and to leave the recipient countries fully as bankrupt as they are today, that the plan will not fight hunger but perpetuate it, not promote recovery but indefinitely postpone it, and last but not least, that it would convert Western Europe into a vast military camp with freedom extinguished. He also said the Berlin airlift, which started in June 1948, was simply a smokescreen whose real purpose was to hide the attempts of monopolists to rebuild and rearm Nazi Germany. As for the Secretary of State, George Marshall, he was allegedly trying to destroy the United Nations, using it as a forum for reckless attacks on Russia, a forum for incitement to war. And the United States was descending into fascism. We recognize Hitlerite methods when we see them in our own land. In contrast to this rather paranoid attitude toward the Marshall Plan and the politics of the American government, Wallace was willing to give the benefit of the doubt to communists, once going so far as to claim, "I doubt if any Marxists today, apparently including Stalin, are as violent as Lincoln and Jefferson were in their day." This kind of cluelessness about communism was already on display when Wallace visited Russia as vice president in 1944. After the visit, he gave reports about the excellent conditions enjoyed by workers in the gold mines of Kolyma, without realizing at all that the Potemkin villages shown to him were in fact the infamous Kolyma camps, the most dreaded part of the Soviet Gulag. It was painful and hugely embarrassing for Wallace when a few years later he had to confess that at the time of his visit to Kolyma, he had not the slightest idea that there were many slave labor camps in Siberia in 1944, and that it was Eleanor Lipper, a Belgian woman who had spent 11 years as a slave laborer in the Gulag, who had to explain to him later the great effort put forth by the Soviet authorities to pull the wool over our eyes and make Magadan into a Potemkin village for my inspection. Wallace's public statements raised a lot of questions among political commentators about his competence as a politician and even worries about his ability to perceive some basic facts about the world. Here are some selected illustrations, all taken from major newspapers like the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and Minneapolis Tribune. It was somehow painful and embarrassing to see the press conference of a former vice president of the United States turned into something hardly more edifying than the baiting of a village idiot. If Mr. Wallace had suddenly dropped from another planet, he could scarcely have spoken with more naivete as to what is happening in the world today. He does not recognize the policy of violence and the adherence to Moscow when the evidence is plainly before his eyes. In order to justify the course he has taken, he is insulating himself in a dream world. The candidate was the portrait of a man wandering in a pink fog, a man who gropes his confused and uncertain way through a cloud-like mass of unrealities. These outgivings do not necessarily prove that Wallace is nutty. They may merely prove that he has been chased out on a limb by the facts and does not know how to get back, except by denying that the facts exist. These widely expressed concerns about Wallace's frightening inability to grasp political realities did not bother many of his supporters, simply because they shared even those of his views that most others regarded as downright preposterous. It seems that Carnap belonged to that group of uncritical supporters of Wallace, probably along with Einstein and Gödel. In a letter to Sidney Hook in 1949, Carnap wrote, "The maintenance of peace seems to me the main problem and task today, more important even than civil liberties." In response, Hook made the obvious point that the war against Hitler had been waged on the exactly opposite principle, i.e., that when freedom was under the threat of totalitarianism, preserving civil liberties was indeed more important than peace. So why should the Western world announce a reversal of these priorities and put peace before liberty, precisely at the time when it was confronted again with a totalitarian state, which not only had killed millions of its own people and enslaved the rest for 30 years, but was also busy using its military force to subjugate other countries? An even better response to Carnap is what Albert Camus said in Stockholm in 1957 after receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature. "I think that peace is the greatest possession, but not worth entering servitude to protect." But even in those situations, when Carnap did fight for civil liberties, he again had strange priorities. For example, while he blew out of all proportion fears about dangers to basic freedoms from the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950, about which more in a moment, he showed no evidence of being much bothered by the very real and massive oppression that was at that very time occurring in the Soviet Union, and was characterized by extrajudicial executions, arrests by secret police, and millions of completely innocent people starving or being imprisoned for years in labor camps. In connection with the McCarran Act, a number of academics and other prominent people, including Carnap, wrote an open letter to President Truman on January 27, 1952, urging him to direct the Department of Justice to cease immediately steps recently announced to establish concentration camps in the United States. The very next day, the Daily Worker published an article under a strident headline. A few months later, Carnap signed a similar letter addressed to congressional candidates that claimed the McCarran Act has already led to serious infringements of the Bill of Rights and is responsible for the intolerable situation in which government agencies, in a manner all too reminiscent of Nazi Germany, are already preparing concentration camps, are holding thought control hearings, are denying passports to citizens, and are deporting and refusing admission to aliens. Of course, there were strong disagreements at the time about the wisdom of the McCarran Act. After all, President Truman, who was a reactionary, according to Gödel, vetoed it, but his veto was overruled by a huge majority who voted in favor of it, both in the House and in the Senate, and on a bipartisan basis. So, reasonable people could indeed have different opinions about it. But they could hardly share Carnap's view that the American government was preparing concentration camps in a manner all too reminiscent of Nazi Germany. Or so I will argue. What was the McCarran Act actually? One of its most controversial provisions was the Emergency Detention Act of 1950, which allowed, in a time of internal security emergency, the detention of people who there was reasonable ground to believe would commit espionage or sabotage. This is the source of the concentration camp scare. But it was specified that the president was authorized to proclaim the existence of an internal security emergency only if at least one of the following three situations occurred. 1. Invasion of the territory of the United States or its possessions. 2. Declaration of war by Congress. Or 3. Insurrection within the United States in aid of a foreign enemy. So it was not as if the law described the conditions for detention very vaguely, thereby making it easy for the president to detain his opponents at will. It clearly said, only in cases of invasion, declared war, or insurrection in aid of a foreign enemy. Also, the act ended with the following sentence: nothing contained in this title shall be construed to suspend or to authorize the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. Therefore, arbitrary detention continued to be prohibited under this law. Let me stress again that I am not defending the passing of the McCarran Act. I am only trying to show that, given its content, the suggestion that it opened the door to Nazi-like concentration camps in the United States was ludicrous. Many people were against this law because they thought that giving such additional powers to the executive branch could lead to encroachments on civil liberties, and that communism was not really so great a threat to the United States as to require such legislative measures. Others reluctantly supported the act, believing its provisions were necessary to deal with a very serious danger. Interestingly, even the liberal Senator Hubert Humphrey supported the McCarran Act, saying, "We are not living in a perfect world, and when there is a real menace to our internal security, we must be able to act with speed and certainty." Surely Humphrey was not preparing the ground for an American Hitler. I do not want to start a debate here about who had the better argument, opponents of the McCarran Act or its advocates. Of course, no invasion, declaration of war, or insurrection ever occurred during the Cold War, so it might seem that critics who said the act was an overreaction to the Soviet threat were in some respects vindicated. But a precaution introduced against a certain possible threat is not shown to have been unreasonable just because the threat eventually did not materialize. We often have to make decisions under the conditions of imperfect knowledge and prepare for meeting dangers that have different degrees of probability. Let me just mention one close call counterfactual that undermines the widespread belief that the fear of communism was hysterical and completely unreasonable. Had Roosevelt died just a few months earlier than he did, he would have been succeeded by his then Vice President, Henry Wallace, who, according to his own later statement, would have chosen Lawrence Duggan as his Secretary of State and Harry Dexter White as his Secretary of the Treasury. There is strong evidence that both of these men worked for the Soviets. As Christopher Andrew, professor of history at the University of Cambridge, notes, the fact that Roosevelt survived 3 months into an unprecedented fourth term in the White House and replaced Wallace with Harry Truman as vice president in January 1945 deprived Soviet intelligence of what would have been its most spectacular success in penetrating a major Western government. The story of the letter in which Carnap and others warned about American concentration camps does not end here. It surfaced soon afterward in a much larger context. First, on July 6, 1952, the American representative to the United Nations, Walter Kochnig, submitted to the UN Commission on Forced Labor massive documentary evidence, which the New York Times called conclusive, about the large-scale slave labor in the Soviet Union. According to the report, Soviet slavery existed on a scope unknown in the history of man, and, for the most part, these slaves are not ordinary criminals, but political prisoners, men and women sentenced to living death for real or suspected opposition to the Soviet regime. Just 10 days later, the Soviets responded to Kochnig's report. The interesting part in the Soviet delegate's speech is how he attempted to neutralize the accusation. He did this not by disputing the evidence of slave labor, but by trying to establish some kind of moral equivalence between the two blocs and accusing the Americans of building concentration camps for persons arrested merely because of their progressive views. Obviously, the letter published in the Daily Worker several months earlier that made the same claim and was signed by many intellectuals, including Carnap, was quite helpful in lending credibility to Soviet propaganda and deflecting world attention from the slave labor issue. What is additionally objectionable about Carnap's political activity is that many of the protests and petitions he signed were published in the Daily Worker, the newspaper of the Communist Party of the United States. So it is not just that some of his criticisms of the American politics were clearly over the top, but they appeared in a publication of a party that notoriously towed the Kremlin line and glorified Stalin's rule, turning a completely blind eye to the plight of tens of millions. There was something grotesque in the behavior of those Western intellectuals who raised the alarm about the imagined American concentration camps for political dissidents, and who did this in a communist newspaper that treated the issue of very real Soviet labor camps as a forbidden topic. The Rosenberg case. Will the real Rudolf Carnap please stand up? Carnap sometimes allowed the distinction between his own political views and the platform of the Communist Party to be blurred almost to the point of their complete fusion. This is best seen in their respective reactions to the notorious case of Julius Rosenberg and his wife Ethel, Americans who were charged with being Russian spies, sentenced to death, and executed in June 1953. Those who at the time campaigned against the death penalty for the Rosenbergs differed among themselves in how strongly they disputed the justification of the court decision. Roughly, they had to choose between the following four possible positions, listed in increasing order of strength. 1. Don't dispute the Rosenbergs' guilt, only claim that the death penalty is too harsh for what they were convicted of. 2. Claim the Rosenbergs' guilt was not proved beyond reasonable doubt. 3. Claim the Rosenbergs are innocent. 4. Claim the Rosenbergs are innocent and that they were framed by the government. Obviously, there is a world of difference between 1 and 4. While 1 only questions the severity of the sentence, which in the case of death penalty often makes at least some sense, 4 is committed not merely to the innocence of the convicted couple, but includes also a far-fetched conspiracy theory, i.e., the claim that the government contrived the evidence against two innocent people so that a verdict of guilty was assured. Normally, anyone who was ready to go only so far as 1 would never allow his name to be used in a public campaign for 4. But it seems that Carnap did exactly this. Here is Carnap's opinion about the Rosenberg case, which clearly amounts to no more than, the court has greatly overstated the importance of the scientific information contained in the sketches of implosion lenses by Ethel Rosenberg's brother, David Greenglass, or by any accompanying details which a man with his very limited theoretical background was able to furnish. For this reason, I feel that the severity of the sentence is out of proportion to the actual damage that could have possibly been done. In contrast, the short report about the campaign for the Rosenbergs, published in the Daily Worker January 14, 1953, stating they were innocent and framed, which amounts to claim. Notice that Carnap's name, among others, is appended below the text, which many a reader probably took to mean that Carnap stood behind the very strong statement. It is worth pointing out that other people on the list include Einstein and another well-known philosopher, Charles Morris. 6. We have two good reasons to believe that in all likelihood Carnap was not committed to 4. First, if he was, why would he then defend only a much weaker claim 1? And second, no convincing evidence existed at the time, nor later for that matter, for a minimally responsible person to claim confidently and publicly that the Rosenbergs were both innocent and framed. And yet, for all we know, Carnap never explained why he allowed his name to be used in support of a view that he probably did not fully endorse. A possible, and in my opinion plausible, answer is that he had such close ties with the Daily Worker, as well as with many communists and fellow travelers, that he just didn't think this false attribution was an important matter. Against the background of the views Carnap shared with the extreme left, see above, This kind of misinterpretation may have been something he found easy to accept. But if this was indeed the way Carnap operated in his political activities, then he has only himself to blame if many people came to the conclusion that he was ideologically much closer to the Communist Party than he actually was. At the beginning of the Cold War, Carnap was investigated by the FBI for potential subversive activities. It is easy to condemn these suspicions and find it ridiculous that the FBI had a file on a harmless professor of philosophy. I agree that there is no evidence that Carnap was involved in anything illegal, let alone that he was a spy or Soviet agent. The question might be raised, though, whether this was all so evident at the time, but I obviously cannot go deeper into this. After all, my interest is in Carnap, not the FBI. The main point is this. Even if we conclude that the behavior of the FBI was silly, we are still left with the separate question of what we should think about Carnap's excursions into politics. I maintain that when he entered the political arena, Carnap largely abandoned those characteristics that graced his philosophical work: careful thinking, consistency, and objectivity.